The night was dark and desolate, the kind that wraps around you like a suffocating shroud. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, the faint glow of the dashboard lights casting eerie shadows across my face. I had been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the engine, the only sound breaking the silence of the night. The highway stretched out before me like a never-ending ribbon of asphalt, surrounded on either side by an endless expanse of forest. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. I shivered despite the warmth of the car, an icy chill creeping up my spine. As I rounded a bend in the road, something caught my eye up ahead. A figure standing on the shoulder, barely visible in the dim glow of the headlights. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached, the figure coming into focus as I drew nearer. It was a woman, her long dark hair blowing in the wind, her eyes empty and hollow. I slowed the car to a stop beside her, my hand hesitating on the door handle. Something about her seemed off, sending a shiver down my spine. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond, simply staring ahead with a vacant expression. A sense of unease washed over me, my instincts screaming at me to drive away. But something held me in place, an irrational curiosity urging me to stay. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Still, she remained silent, her gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. With a sense of foreboding, I reached over and unlocked the passenger door, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. Without a word, the woman clambered into the car beside me, her presence sending a chill down my spine. The air seemed to grow colder, the darkness pressing in around us like a suffocating blanket. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. There was something about her that unnerved me, a sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite place. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Again, she didn't respond, simply staring ahead with those empty, hollow eyes. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, the silence stretching out between us like a yawning chasm. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was as if the world around us had shifted, the very fabric of reality warping and twisting in the darkness. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught my eye, something darting out from the shadows at the edge of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. Heart pounding, I peered into the darkness, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But there was nothing there, only the empty expanse of forest stretching out into the night. I turned to the woman beside me, a question on my lips. But she was gone, vanished into thin air as if she had never been there at all. A cold sweat broke out on my brow as I realized the truth. I was alone on that desolate stretch of highway, with nothing but the darkness and the empty expanse of forest stretching out before me. With trembling hands, I shifted the car into gear and pressed down on the accelerator, eager to escape the nightmare that had unfolded before my eyes. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, I knew that I would never be able to forget the empty highway and the horrors that lurked within its shadows. The road was a desolate ribbon cutting through the heart of nowhere, winding its way through dense forest like a serpent slithering through the shadows. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white with tension as I navigated the twists and turns of the unfamiliar highway. It was well past midnight, and the darkness outside pressed in on me like a suffocating weight. I had been driving for hours, the only company the faint hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as they danced in the wind. But as the miles stretched on, a sense of unease began to creep over me, a primal instinct warning me that I was not alone. I glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see some sinister figure lurking in the darkness behind me. But there was nothing there, only the empty expanse of road stretching out into the night. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin, focusing instead on the road ahead. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I rounded a bend in the road, a flicker of movement caught my eye up ahead. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what it was. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, silhouetted against the faint glow of the headlights. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest as the car skidded to a stop. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, a sense of dread twisting in the pit of my stomach. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky with fear. There was no response, only the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the silence. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that the figure was not moving, as if frozen in time. I glanced around nervously, searching for any sign of life in the surrounding darkness. But there was nothing there, only the empty expanse of forest stretching out in every direction. With a sense of growing unease, I stepped out of the car and cautiously approached the figure in the road. As I drew nearer, I could see that it was a woman, her hair wild and unkempt, her clothes tattered and torn. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't respond, only staring ahead with empty, vacant eyes. A chill ran down my spine as I reached out to touch her shoulder, my hand recoiling at the icy coldness of her skin. And then, without warning, she spoke, her voice low and hollow, like the whisper of the wind through the trees. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her words sending a shiver down my spine. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" But she didn't answer, only turning and disappearing into the darkness like a ghost fading into the night. With trembling hands, I stumbled back to my car and peeled out onto the road, eager to escape the nightmare that had unfolded before my eyes. But as I drove on, the feeling of unease lingered, a nagging sense that I was being watched, that something sinister lurked just beyond the edge of the darkness. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, I knew that I would never forget the toll road and the horrors that had unfolded there in the dead of night. The night was heavy, with an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the headlights of my car as I drove down the deserted highway. I had been on the road for hours, the monotony broken only by occasional flickers of distant streetlights and the occasional eerie glow of the moon peeking through the clouds. As the minutes ticked by, exhaustion began to gnaw at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to pull me into an unwelcome slumber. But the thought of pulling over to rest filled me with a sense of unease. The desolate stretch of road seemed to hold secrets best left undisturbed. Just as I was about to succumb to the weariness pulling at my eyelids, I saw her. A lone figure standing at the side of the road, her form illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. My foot instinctively eased off the gas pedal as I approached, my mind warring between caution and curiosity. As I drew closer, I could make out more details. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with long dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders in wild waves. Her figure was shrouded in darkness, but her eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly intensity. A sense of foreboding crept over me as I slowed the car to a stop beside her, the engine purring softly in the night air. Despite the unease prickling at the back of my neck, I rolled down the window and called out to her. "Are you all right? Do you need a ride?" My voice seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable in the dim light. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had frozen, the world holding its breath in anticipation. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she nodded, her lips curling into a faint smile that sent shivers down my spine. Without a word, she opened the passenger door and climbed inside, the scent of earth and decay clinging to her like a heavy cloak. I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I shifted the car back into gear and continued down the darkened highway. The silence between us was thick with tension, broken only by the occasional whisper of the wind as it danced through the trees. I stole glances at her from the corner of my eye, but she sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the windshield. It was as though she were a spectre, a silent passenger on a journey into the unknown. As the miles slipped away beneath the wheels of the car, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, terribly, irreversibly wrong. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she spoke, her voice a low, haunting whisper that seemed to echo in the confines of the car. "You shouldn't have stopped for me," she said, her words sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at her in surprise, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" But she didn't answer, only turned to face me with eyes that burned like coals in the darkness. And then, without warning, she reached out and grabbed the steering wheel, wrenching it sharply to the side. The car careened off the road and into the darkness beyond, the sound of screeching metal and breaking glass filling the air. As the world spun and twisted around me, I realized with a sinking horror that I had made a grave mistake, one that would cost me more than I could ever imagine. And as the darkness swallowed me whole, I knew that I would never again venture out onto the lonely highways of the night. For in the darkness, there are things that lurk, things that should never be disturbed. The night was thick with fog as I drove down the deserted highway, my headlights cutting through the mist like knives. I glanced at the fuel gauge, the needle hovering dangerously close to empty. Panic began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. I was miles away from the nearest town, with no sign of civilization in sight. Just as desperation threatened to overwhelm me, a faint glow appeared on the horizon, the telltale lights of a gas station flickering in the darkness like a beacon of hope. Relief flooded through me as I pulled into the gravel lot, the sound of the engine echoing in the stillness of the night. But as I stepped out of the car and approached the building, a sense of unease washed over me like a wave crashing against the shore. There was something off about the place, an eerie stillness that hung in the air like a shroud. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the bell above the entrance jingling softly in the silence. The interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously overhead. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with dusty cans and expired snacks that seemed to leer at me from their perch. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response, only the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the tiled floor. A chill ran down my spine as I made my way to the counter, where a lone figure stood shrouded in darkness. "Can I help you?" the figure asked, their voice muffled and indistinct. I hesitated, a feeling of unease prickling at the back of my neck. I need to fill up my tank," I stammered, my words barely above a whisper. Without a word, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness behind the counter. I watched nervously as they reappeared a moment later, a rusted key dangling from their outstretched hand. "Pump number 3, they said, their voice barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. I took the key with trembling hands and made my way back outside, the fog swirling around me like a sinister cloak. As I approached the pump, I glanced around nervously, half expecting to see some lurking figure hiding in the shadows. But there was nothing there, only the empty expanse of darkness stretching out into the night. With a sense of growing unease, I inserted the key into the lock and began to fill up the tank, the sound of gasoline gurgling through the nozzle like a macabre lullaby. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. A low, guttural growl emanating from the darkness behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned, my eyes scanning the empty lot for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows, their gaze filled with a hunger that sent a shiver down my spine. Without hesitation, I dropped the nozzle and stumbled back, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. With a sense of mounting dread, I turned and ran back towards the safety of my car, the roar of the engine drowning out the sound of my pounding heart. I glanced back one last time, just in time to see the figure emerge from the darkness, its form twisted and contorted in ways that defied comprehension. With a cry of terror, I slammed the door shut and peeled out of the parking lot, the headlights cutting through the fog like a knife through butter. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The gas station, along with the figure and the glowing eyes, had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but an empty expanse of darkness. And as I drove on into the night, I knew that I would never forget the terror that had unfolded there in the darkness. A terror that lurked just beyond the edge of the headlights, waiting to pounce on unsuspecting travelers who dared to venture into the unknown. The road stretched out before me like a ribbon of asphalt, disappearing into the darkness of the night. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white with tension as I navigated the winding curves of the desolate highway. It was well past midnight, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I had been driving for hours, the monotony broken only by the occasional passing car or flicker of distant headlights. But as the miles slipped away beneath the wheels of my car, a sense of unease began to settle over me like a thick fog, creeping into every corner of my mind. It was then that I saw it, a sign looming out of the darkness, its letters barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. "Detour ahead," it read, an arrow pointing ominously down a narrow side road that branched off from the main highway. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to keep driving, to ignore the sign and press on into the night. But curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I was turning off the main road and onto the deserted detour. The road was rough and uneven, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as I navigated the twists and turns of the unfamiliar path. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, suffocating and oppressive in its intensity. As I drove on, the sense of unease grew stronger, a creeping sensation that crawled up my spine like 1,000 tiny spiders. I glanced nervously out the window, half expecting to see some sinister figure lurking in the shadows. And then I saw her, a lone figure standing at the side of the road, her form barely visible in the darkness. My heart skipped a beat as I slowed the car to a stop beside her, the engine idling softly in the silence. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond, only stared ahead with vacant, empty eyes. A shiver ran down my spine as I reached over and unlocked the passenger door, the sound of the hinges creaking in the stillness of the night. Without a word, she climbed into the car beside me, her presence sending a chill down my spine. The air seemed to grow colder, the darkness pressing in around us like a suffocating blanket. I tried to make conversation, to break the eerie silence that hung between us like a heavy fog. But she remained silent, her gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. As we drove on, the road seemed to stretch out endlessly before us, the landscape unchanged and desolate. I tried to shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at my insides, to focus instead on the road ahead. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was as if the world around us had shifted, the very fabric of reality warping and twisting in the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, vanished into thin air as if she had never been there at all. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the darkness for any sign of her presence. But there was nothing there, only the empty expanse of road stretching out into the night. With a sense of mounting dread, I turned the car around and sped back towards the main highway, desperate to escape the nightmare that had unfolded before my eyes. As I merged back onto the main road, a sense of relief washed over me like a tidal wave. But deep down, I knew that I would never be able to forget the haunted detour and the horrors that lurked within its shadows, waiting to ensnare unsuspecting travelers who dared to venture into the darkness.